My son was silent at the retreat, but my stepson did this overnight and I froze. I thought the weekend was for healing, for reconnecting, but what happened that night changed everything. One glance, one touch, and suddenly, I wasn't sure who I was anymore. I wasn't always this hollow. There was a time when I smiled without forcing it, when laughter didn't feel like a lie. But somewhere between being a second wife, a full-time caretaker, and a woman fading into the wallpaper, I stopped existing for myself. My husband, Daniel, isn't cruel. He's not abusive. That would make this easier to explain. No, he's just distant, consumed by work. His phone, his calendar. Somewhere along the way, I became a background detail in his life. Like the grocery list he barely glances at. I prepare dinner. He eats in silence. I try to talk, and he nods without hearing. Nights are colder than winter, even when he's lying next to me. We haven't been intimate in months. Maybe longer. Honestly, I've stopped keeping track. It feels like living with a polite stranger, one who thanks you for the coffee but never asks how you're doing. Then there are the boys. My son, Evan, is 17, quiet, observant, and drifting further away from me every day. And Ethan, my stepson from Daniel's first marriage, moved in with us last year after a falling out with his mom. 19, polite, emotionally unreadable. He mostly keeps to himself. Though lately, I've noticed small shifts. I didn't know it then, but the cracks had already started forming, and all it took was one retreat, 3 days away from routine, for everything to fracture in ways I couldn't imagine. That was the beginning of the end, or maybe the start of something else. Evan used to be my shadow. When he was little, he followed me everywhere, curious, talkative, full of questions I didn't always have answers for. Now, at 17, he barely looks up from his screen. He eats in silence, locks his bedroom door, and responds to my check-ins with tired shrugs or single syllables. I keep telling myself it's just a phase, but some days, it feels like I've already lost him. Then there's Ethan. He moved in after things fell apart with his mother. It wasn't supposed to be permanent, just until he found stability. But months passed, and he stayed. We were polite at first, like guests sharing a roof. But somewhere along the way, that changed. It was small things, the way he'd linger a moment longer in the kitchen, offer to carry groceries, ask if I'd eaten. He noticed when I cut my hair, when I cried silently doing the dishes. He didn't pretend not to see. Unlike Evan, who drifted, Ethan observed, quietly, carefully. And I started to feel seen, not just as a mother or wife, but as someone with aching, unspoken parts. I didn't know yet how dangerous that feeling could become. Daniel couldn't make it, quarter-end chaos, he said, kissing my cheek like he was clocking in. So it ended up just me, Evan, and Ethan, 3 pieces of a family puzzle that never quite fit. The retreat center was tucked deep in the woods, a 2-hour drive from home. Pine trees lined the winding road, sunlight flickering through branches like a warning. The place looked peaceful enough, wooden cabins, soft music from wind chimes, couples holding hands as they walked the gravel paths. But inside me, there was nothing calm. We were assigned a shared family suite, one big room with 3 beds. No locks, no privacy. Connection requires openness. The facilitator smiled. I nodded, pretending to agree. The first day was filled with forced smiles and awkward group exercises. Trust falls, eye contact drills, journaling sessions. Evan kept his hood on. Ethan quietly participated, occasionally glancing at me during partner activities when Daniel's absence became obvious. That night, we sat around the fireplace with other families, taking turns sharing something we'd never said aloud. When it was my turn, my throat tightened. I feel invisible at home, I said. No one reacted, except Ethan. His gaze didn't flinch. Later, back in our cabin, I found a folded note on my pillow. It read, in Ethan's handwriting, "You're not invisible. I see you." I sat for a long time, holding that note like it was something sacred. Somehow, it terrified me more than comforted me. The second day began with something called paired vulnerability. Each participant was asked to partner with a family member and go through a set of guided questions, touch-based trust exercises, physical proximity work, and eye contact in silence. I was assigned to Ethan. We sat on yoga mats in the open-air pavilion. Morning sunlight poured in through the wooden slats. I could hear birds outside. But inside, my heartbeat was deafening. Ethan sat across from me, his knees just inches from mine. Hold eye contact for 60 seconds, the facilitator instructed. At first, it felt mechanical, but then something shifted. His eyes weren't just looking at me, they were reading me. As if he saw past the surface, into the quiet desperation I tried so hard to hide. I looked away first. Later, during the trust touch exercise, he was told to place his hand gently on my shoulder and keep it there while I described a moment when I felt alone. My voice shook. There was a night last winter. I sat in the kitchen crying into a cup of tea. No one noticed. His grip didn't change, just steady, warm. When it was his turn to speak, he said, "I've never seen someone carry sadness as silently as you." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in the shared cabin, listening to the breathing of my two boys. The air felt thick, like it held questions no one dared to ask. I turned to the side and saw Ethan staring at the ceiling, hands folded over his chest. He didn't look at me. But somehow, I knew, without words, without movement, we had both crossed a line. Maybe only in thought, maybe only in silence. But something irreversible had already begun. That night, the wind picked up. Pine branches scraped against the cabin walls like fingers dragging across wood. Evan had gone to sleep early, headphones in, face turned to the wall. Ethan sat at the small table, sketching in his notebook, the glow from a dim lamp casting shadows across his face. I was sitting on my bed, reading, or pretending to. My eyes kept drifting to Ethan, to the curve of his jaw, the way he furrowed his brows when he focused. I hated myself for noticing. At some point, he stood and walked toward the door. "I just need air," he said softly. I followed 5 minutes later. The night outside was silent, cold. The fire pit had burned down to embers. Ethan stood with his arms crossed, staring into the trees. When he turned to me, I expected a casual smile, something safe, but what I saw was unguarded pain, longing, a quiet storm. "I'm sorry if I've made things uncomfortable," he said, voice barely above a whisper. I've never known what it's like to care about someone like this." I should have stopped him there. I should have walked away, but I didn't. Instead, I stepped closer, just enough to feel the warmth coming off his body in the cold air. "I feel like I've been screaming inside for years," I whispered, and no one ever looked back. He didn't touch me, he didn't move. But the space between us felt electric, forbidden, heavy with everything unspoken. And in that terrible, beautiful moment, I didn't feel like a mother, or a wife. I felt like a woman, seen, wanted, trembling on the edge of something she couldn't name. I didn't sleep that night, not because of guilt, but because for the first time in years, I felt awake. The morning light felt cruel. It spilled across the cabin like truth, bright, exposing, relentless. I lay still in bed, eyes open, trying to make sense of the night before. Nothing had happened, not physically, but something inside me had shifted, cracked open like a window I couldn't shut. Ethan moved quietly around the room, gathering his sketchbook, pulling on his jacket. His eyes brushed mine briefly, soft and unreadable, before he stepped outside. Evan was still asleep. I watched his chest rise and fall and wondered, if he ever looked at me now, what would he see? I got up, made coffee with shaking hands, and sat at the tiny table, staring at the steam. My reflection in the window looked older, not just in years, but in the weight of choices not yet made, of feelings I wasn't sure how to name. Later that morning, during a family workshop, the facilitator asked us to share what we'd learned so far. I barely heard what the others said. When it was my turn, my voice cracked. I've realized I'm lonelier than I've ever admitted, and that sometimes silence can be louder than words. Ethan didn't look at me, but he didn't need to. The air between us had changed. It carried tension, unspoken acknowledgement, a quiet guilt. Every glance felt charged, every silence too heavy. At lunch, Evan asked if we could go home early. "This place is weird," he muttered. I nodded, unsure if he sensed anything or if he just hated being here. That afternoon, I found Ethan sketching alone beneath the trees. I didn't sit. I didn't speak. He looked up and said only, "I'm sorry." I nodded once, lips pressed tight. Not because I forgave him, not because I blamed him, but because I knew we had both crossed a line. Not with touch, but with feeling. And in some ways, that was far more dangerous. We drove home in silence. Evan leaned against the window in the back seat, earbuds in, lost in whatever world he escapes to. Ethan sat beside me, his body still, his face unreadable. Every mile that passed, the weight in my chest grew heavier, like I was hauling something behind us that no one could see. Back home, Daniel greeted us with a distracted smile and a half-hug. "How was the retreat?" he asked, eyes never leaving his phone. I forced a laugh. "Therapeutic," I said. "Exhausting." He nodded, already walking away. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed next to my husband, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment at the retreat like a confession I hadn't made. The soft eye contact. The cold air between Ethan and me. The almosts. I told myself we hadn't done anything wrong. No rules were technically broken. But that argument felt paper thin against the shame twisting in my gut. The next morning, I found Ethan in the kitchen. He was making coffee, just like he used to. Calm, gentle, normal. And that scared me more than anything, how easily we could slide back into routine, pretending nothing had shifted. When he handed me a cup, our fingers didn't touch, not even for a second. "I'll be staying with my mom for a while," he said quietly. "I think it's better." I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "Okay. Thank you for seeing me, even when you shouldn't have." He left an hour later. Evan didn't ask questions. Daniel didn't notice. I stood at the kitchen sink, watching Ethan's car disappear down the street, and I realized, the most devastating betrayals don't come from action. They come from what we allow ourselves to feel when we know we shouldn't. That kind of guilt doesn't scream. It whispers. And it never really leaves. Ethan left, but his absence didn't erase what had happened. If anything, it made it louder. The house felt hollow, as if something vital had been pulled from its frame. Evan went back to his usual silence, barely acknowledging either of us. I tried to reach him one evening, asking if he wanted to watch a movie like we used to. He shrugged and said he had homework, though his screen showed nothing but blank pages. Daniel remained distant, absorbed in work and deadlines, unaware, or unwilling to notice, that the woman sleeping beside him was unraveling. Sometimes I looked at him and wondered, if I confessed everything, would he even care, or would it just be another problem to brush aside? One night, he touched my back in bed, softly, absent-mindedly, a gesture he hadn't made in months. I flinched without meaning to. He didn't ask why. Instead, he turned over and went to sleep, as if the gap between us hadn't just widened a little more. I stared at the ceiling, realizing that this wasn't about Ethan anymore. It never truly was. He was just a mirror, reflecting all the things I had buried, all the affection I had craved, all the parts of me that no one in this house seemed to notice. The real betrayal? It wasn't just of my husband or my family. It was of the woman I used to be, before I stopped asking to be seen, and started needing it from someone who never should have been the one to offer it. I often replay that weekend in my mind, not because I want to relive it, but because I can't help searching for the moment where I could have stopped it all. Should I have declined the retreat? Chosen Evan instead of Ethan for those vulnerability exercises? Left the fire pit when he stood too close? There were so many chances. Little off-ramps. But I didn't take them. Because deep down, I didn't want to. That's the hardest part to admit. Not that something happened, but that a part of me welcomed it. Not the outcome, not the danger, but the attention. The recognition. The feeling of mattering, of being seen. And now I live with that. Quietly, carefully. I still go through the motions, cook meals, fold laundry, smile at neighbors, but something in me shifted permanently. I don't look at myself in the mirror the same way. I don't look at Ethan's empty room the same way either. There's no going back to the woman I was before that retreat. But I also can't become the woman I almost let myself be. So I stay in the middle. In limbo. Pretending nothing cracked when in truth, everything did. And I wonder, if it were you? If someone looked at you the way you've always wanted to be seen. If someone reached for your pain when no one else ever had. Would you have turned away? Would you have walked out of the cabin that night? Or would you have stood there, like I did, paralyzed by the ache of being noticed? Tell me, I'm not asking for judgment. I'm asking because, maybe I'm not the only one who's ever stood at that edge. Life went on, as it always does. Ethan didn't return. He sent a message weeks later, just a short, polite note saying he was doing fine and had enrolled in community college. I replied with a smiley face and nothing more. We haven't spoken since. Daniel never asked questions. Maybe he sensed something and chose not to confront it. Or maybe he really was that unaware. Either way, I never told him, not because I wanted to protect myself, but because I didn't think it would make any difference. Some nights, I still think about the cabin, about the firelight flickering across Ethan's face, about the space between us that wasn't crossed, but wasn't safe either. About the quiet, pulsing awareness that we both pretended not to feel. I sit with that memory the way you sit with a scar. It doesn't hurt anymore. But you still feel it when the weather changes. I'm not proud of what happened. I'm not proud of what didn't happen either. But I've learned something in the stillness that followed. The most dangerous feelings aren't the ones that scream. They're the ones that whisper. Gently, see me, please, just see me. And when no one does, you start listening to the wrong voice. I've forgiven myself, but I haven't forgotten. Some silences stay.